Welcome to the Modern Mexico podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. In today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about organized crime in the state of Michoacan, the heart of Mexico's avocado export industry. Overall, Mexico supplies around 80% of the avocados eaten in the U.S., and most of these avocados come from Michoacan. So there's a good chance if you eat an avocado in the U.S., you are consuming a product that comes from one of the most violent and complex states in Mexico. Michoacan, which is located on Mexico's Pacific coast, has a population that is only slightly larger than the U.S. state of Connecticut, but has recorded over 10,000 murders during the administration of Mexico's current president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. The day-to-day violence in Michoacan is alarming. On April 4th, 2023, criminal gunmen engaged in a prolonged shootout with police in Michoacan, killing 2 officers. Over the last few years, cartel gunmen in Michoacan have also employed bomber drones, landmines, and even IEDs. And the state police in Michoacan now use heavy-duty military-style armored trucks. So overall, Mexico is experiencing a record-breaking level of violence right now, but even within that context, Michoacan stands out because of the presence of armed civilian autodefensa self-defense groups who man roadblocks and claim to defend various towns in the state. So it's usually never quite clear what relationship these civilian gunmen have with local organized crime groups. But Michoacan also produces around 3/4 of the avocado grown in Mexico, and it's a crop that earned a record-breaking $3.1 billion in export revenue from U.S. buyers in 2022. So, although Michoacan has found success exporting avocados, in 2023, the state continues to struggle with a complicated mix of social, economic, and security problems. So, in order to discuss the current security dynamic in Michoacan, I reached out to Falko Ernst, a Mexico analyst at the International Crisis Group, an NGO. So, welcome to the podcast, Falko.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
So, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what 3 words would you pick to describe the current security dynamic in Michoacan?
So the 3 words I'd pick that I see as most important to describe those dynamics are fragmented, diversified, and political. And when I say fragmented, I refer to the overall trend of Mexican organized crime to be shattered into many pieces. So we started the war on drugs, to call it this way, in 2006 with a handful of relatively coherent criminal organizations that then, under state pressure, militarization of public policy, and the idea to take out kingpins, got broken up into many, many pieces. So we've gone from that handful of organizations into at least 200 non-state criminal actors that are active in Mexico today. And that number has doubled within the past decade. And one state where that's especially clear is Michoacan, where you used to have one coherent, larger organization, the Knights Templar, that was called La Familia Michoacana before. And during the Autodefensa uprising and state action taken by the then federal government of President Peña Nieto, you ended up with a number of at least 14 criminal groups that have carved up the territory and many smaller fiefdoms. And in terms of how that drives conflict, it's key to understand that none of these groups has amassed sufficient power to steamroll the opposition. So you end up with perpetual fighting and a lot of internal borders that heavily affect civilian populations, their freedom of movement, and their freedom to bring their produce, for instance, and other goods to market. So it's had a deep humanitarian effect and is prolonging conflict in Mexico and Michoacan because not a single group has been able to impose itself and end conflict to produce a more stable model of criminal control, as it were. I say diversified in reference to the still relatively new model of refinancing and making money of criminal groups and their allies in the private sector and the state, because classically speaking, most power within organized crime in Mexico used to be concentrated in drugs trafficking, drugs production, and drugs trafficking on the international scale. And in the past years, you've seen this eminent trend for these groups to turn to a multi commodity approach in the sense that the game now is to control territory, to deeply penetrate into the economics, into different economic chains, into politics, and into populational control, and to leverage that control to then extract rents from the most different commodity chains. So that happens a lot through kidnapping, through extortion, and also through de facto monopolization of certain markets, including in agriculture. And essentially, what this provides criminal groups with is a very great flexibility to refinance by tapping into further unprotected businesses that are licit in origin. So it makes the conflict as such and the groups that participate in it much more stubborn and much more resilient against law enforcement action, but also against shocks in particular markets, because there's always something else to turn to and to extract money from, that they need to buy guns, to finance and pay their personnel, and to pay off politicians. And I say political because we have this tendency from the outside, especially, and also from Mexico City, looking at high conflict regions such as Michoacan in Mexico, to see these groups as something autonomous. But one of their key resources really comes from their ties to the state, to state institutions. They gain access through elections, for instance, by financing campaigns, by applying violence and applying other kinds of pressures, by being able to channel votes to this or that candidate that will play game with you if you hold that power. And they get a number of key resources from state institutions, above all, the fact that law enforcement and prosecutorial services will not act against you if you strike the right kind of agreements. That ultimately means that you're afforded with impunity, and without impunity, you cannot survive as a criminal organization. So access to the state is absolutely central. And there's another aspect to these groups haven't been constituted as de facto political actors, in the sense that, as I already mentioned, they hold great power over populations, and they regulate in many areas daily life. They take up positions of applying or withholding justice, solving everyday problems, and really governing populations in a way that constitutes them as de facto political actors, which again gives them great leverage towards the formal political system.
Okay, very interesting. So you chose the words political, fragmented, and diversified to describe the current dynamic in Michoacan. And I think it's interesting that, we know that 10,000 people have been murdered in Michoacan during the presidency of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. But you didn't use the word war to describe what's happening on the ground. And I think it's interesting that you picked the word political. And I think rather than using the word war, maybe it's helpful to use the word warlord and think about the criminal actors as also being political actors who are, deeply engaged with politics and business and the state, and not simply armed criminals who are either shooting at each other or shooting at the police or soldiers. And with that in mind, I'm wondering, is there any one big concept that you think that people really need to understand about the security dynamic in Michoacan?
Yeah, especially when we talk about state crime ties as something key to explaining the current state of conflict in Michoacan and also other parts, increasingly so in Mexico and high conflict regions, is that corruption per se, as a means of establishing contracts between rogue state actors and criminal actors, has become dysfunctional. When I say corruption has become dysfunctional, I mean that corruption per se isn't anything new. There's a large and very long trajectory of the Mexican state engaging in nefarious ways with criminal groups. But you've had the phenomenon that from 2000, where you have political variation at the highest level of the state in the presidency, you have a nominal democracy. The state has lost its central governing power to regulate and discipline criminal actors because you have too many different competing opposing interests capturing parts of the state and acting out of different interests that are not combined. So you lose the capacity to streamline informal governance, as it were, and that ultimately translates into leverage for criminal groups to access the state through different channels. But at the same time, you end up with a mosaic of opposing, again, competing state criminal networks. And ultimately, that means that state power as such has been hyper fragmented. It doesn't have the capacity anymore to discipline, to streamline, to keep these guys at bay. And ultimately, that just means that you don't have the capacity to apply any formal or informal policy consistently. And I think one grand example of this is that under the Calderon administration, so under the administration of the former president who called out the war on drugs, said he was going all in with military force to get these guys out of their holes, to get them off the streets, to smoke them out. That even then, the whole policy of militarization and going after kingpins was applied very incoherently, because it ultimately resulted that the chief architect of the whole strategy, Garcia Luna, was colluded with the Sinaloa cartel, which in exchange for this didn't receive the wrath of the strategy while it was applied to other groups. And at the end of the day, this creates instability within this system. And for criminal groups, it's a huge problem because you invest into ties with the state. You need to have this access to the state in order to survive, to draw resources from it. But state actors at the same time promise all kinds of different things, candidates for governorships, for instance, to opposing criminal groups. And then once in office, they can't deliver anymore. And then you as a criminal group, you still have to push for these contracts to be made good on. And instead of more peaceful means, you escalate your language of negotiation to violence. And that is a huge factor that has been driving conflict, that's driving instability, and keeps this whole conflict in a perpetual state that is gradually worsening, with criminal groups digging in deeper and deeper over time.
Okay, very interesting. So I know I just saw something recently that the World Justice Project ranks Mexico in the bottom fifth of the world's countries in terms of the strength of rule of law. So in terms of rule of law, they actually rank Mexico as worse than Sierra Leone or the Philippines. So I think it's an interesting lens for viewing the violence if we say that violence is a tool for corrupt negotiations. It can help us understand what's happening at the local level in different parts of Michoacan and in other parts of Mexico. And I know that you have spent a lot of time in Michoacan and you've visited, some of the most remote parts of the state and talked to a lot of um, gunmen who work for different organized crime groups, talked to locals who are dealing with the violence. And I think you have a pretty unique perspective to what's happening on the ground. And I'm wondering, when you think about Michoacan, what grade would you give President Lopez Obrador for his security policies there?
Right. So I'd give him a D minus. The problem is that there's an inefficient translation into policy of certain ambitions that might exist at the level of the presidency right now. So I think one thing they have, or he has recognized, that is that past formulations that solely bet on force have backfired and have increased instability and violence in the country, with Mexican populations, civilian populations, really bearing the brunt of this backfiring. And this is something we're seeing across Latin America, that you have an increasing number of, political leaders that are not willing to carry those costs anymore of a model that has been chiefly exported by the United States. So they're rethinking their approaches to insecurity and how to protect populations. But the problem in Mexico is that even though you have a hyper pragmatic approach by some state actors, including the military, to some of these criminal groups, is that there's this will to better manage violence, insecurity, organized criminal power, and also corruption, instead of eradicating it, which is something that hasn't really worked over the past 2 decades, is that they do not tackle the root causes that you would need to tackle in order to have coherent instruments for the implementation of any formal or informal policy in place, i.e., if you still have these diversified, highly fragmented ties between criminal groups and state actors, ultimately any policy will be undermined and distorted, watered down in the process of implementation, because you, as a criminal group, and this is something I'm being told very clearly by my criminal interview partners, as it were, some of those leaders of the groups that populate the underworld, as it were, in Michoacan, are telling me that they have very good access and get favors from different fragments of the same state institutions. So one group will have access to one general or one lieutenant, will get information from them, will get favors in the sense of military operations being withheld against the group and being applied to other groups instead. But then you talk to the other group, and they have similar analog deals with other personnel, with other commanders of the same force. And this is something that comes out even more clearly when you look at state police forces, for instance, where different fragments, different segments of the same institution are essentially pitted against each other because they collaborate with competing criminal interests. This is something, for instance, that I've seen on the ground many times. I've built a conversation of trust, I would say, over time with some of those criminal leaders. And when I go to those areas, they will let me tag along. And in one situation, particularly, that led to me being dragged along more than being able to tag along, to the build up to an offensive they were planning and executing against an enemy group. And we did a stop on the way to the actual build up of sicarios, of troops on the ground. And we stopped by the local state police commander, where my contact from the criminal group was talking through the strategy of the day's offensive with the commander. And then both state police and cartel forces, if you want to call them that, headed into battle together. So you have a very clear overlap between these groups. But then again, their enemy groups also had deals with other fragments of state police. And to make a long story short, as long as you have these differential ties within state institutions to different criminal groups, that means that on the ground, uh, policy and operations will be watered down, will be distorted, and the president would have to fix that in order to actually lower criminal ambition and criminal infighting for good. So, and that is something that's not happening right now. The official stance is that corruption doesn't exist anymore, especially not within the armed forces. Realities on the ground are very different from this. And as long as we keep on denying the problems that exist, that we would have to fix to get violence down, the reality is that criminal groups will find access to the state and will be able to survive through these points of access. And that is simply something that Lopez Obrador hasn't tackled yet, i.e., I'm giving it a D minus for that. Not a complete fail, because a rethinking is there, at least an ambition, but the execution is been poor at best so far.
Okay, interesting. So I know that on a recent episode of the podcast, security expert Vonda Felbat Brown gave Lopez Obrador a failing grade for his security policies overall. And one of the things she said is that she views the National Guard as basically being very expensive mannequins who are posted at checkpoints in different places in the country and do patrols, but don't do very much to investigate or dismantle organized crime groups. And it sounds like in some degree you might be willing to go even a step beyond that and say that it isn't just that security forces in Mexico aren't doing enough to investigate organized crime. In many cases, at the local level, they're really part of the problem. And in my book, I wrote a chapter about Michoacan's avocado sector, and I visit a town called Tancitaro, which is the epicenter of Mexico's multi-billion-dollar a year avocado export industry. And I remember this really surreal moment where I chatted with an avocado orchard owner in the quiet shade underneath the canopy of trees on his property. And it was a real juxtaposition between the very hectic dynamic that we saw in the streets outside. There were gunmen in civilian clothes and t-shirts, wearing flak jackets and carrying assault rifles, who were manning security checkpoints that basically look like medieval castles. And there were, gunmen from a number of different groups. Some of them wore local police jackets, others were just wearing regular civilian clothes, and it was always kind of unclear who the civilian gunmen were or what relationship they had with local organized crime groups. Why were they patrolling the streets all the time? Who was paying them to be there? And the avocado orchard owner told me something very interesting. He said, "The government doesn't rule here, but it's under control. You can relax." And that really stuck with me, just this idea of the contrast between the order of the orchard, which was a meticulously run organization, and the chaos and sometimes scary security dynamic that was happening, a few 100 feet away on the streets outside of the orchard. Um, so when I think about Michoacan, I think about that avocado grower, and something that he said to me is that there's always rumors that a lot of drug money has been funneled into avocado orchards, and over the last few years, it's possible that organized crime groups have killed or intimidated some of the original owners in the area, and it's possible that organized crime groups are now operating avocado farms. But he just seems to dismiss it as a basic fact of life, and he had zero faith that Mexican police or prosecutors would investigate or try to clean up the sector. And I'm wondering, is this dynamic that I saw in the avocado sector similar to things that you've seen in other business sectors in Michoacan?
Yeah, very much. I mean, it all goes back to the diversification of the business model and the way that criminal groups have come to relate to territory in Michoacan and also in other parts of Mexico. So, again, through the loss of a coherent state control model, they have been able to dig in deeper. And some of the criminal leaders I sit down with, other observers who have good insight into these questions on the ground, essentially describe a model where over time these groups have found it easier and easier, especially now under the passiveness of the current administration that's being accentuated, that they get to dig in deeper into local economies, into politics, and into populational control. And this is repeated in every sub-region of the state, essentially, and it only depends on what the greatest value chain, the most lush commodity chain is. But you will find a similar getting into a different refinancing by tapping into licit commodity chains and business activities across the state and also in many other states in Mexico. So, if from the avocado growing region, which is a bit higher up because it needs the mixture between heat and colder nights and higher rainfall, you drop from this avocado belt, as it's called, into the hotland where you have very dry conditions, which are ideal for citrus fruit production, for instance, also very export oriented, um, including limes and grapefruit, for instance. We will find the same model where criminal groups have either, and including through force, taken over orchards, or where there are um, criminal actors that control access to market. So you can't, even if you're still autonomous as a producer, export without paying a criminal surcharge because you have to go through export channels and packing plans, or where you have a simple extortion model of producers where they have to pay up for each kilo essentially that they produce and then again want to bring to market. It's also been a trend for these groups to, and especially the leaders, to channel their money into purchasing. Many times, again, by being able to back their offers through violence or preferential rates, buying up orchards, and really becoming a type of multi entrepreneurial strongman on the local level. So they run their own orchards and feed that directly into exports, for instance. And then closer to the coast, the same has essentially happened with natural resources and the mining industry. Closer to the border to Jalisco, you have a lot of berry production, including blackberries and so on and so forth, also being sent a lot to the United States for consumption. And you will find different models. So it's really not about one commodity anymore. It's not just about avocados, even though avocados remain a very healthy basis for income for these criminal interests because you're talking about a $4 billion industry, but it repeats itself in every sub-region, and that is something that's not limited to Michoacan. But for instance, if you go into other states like Veracruz, you will also find essentially what have become blood pineapples, and it's just a huge list. By now, the portfolio really includes dozens of items from licit economic activities and illicit economic activities.
So, I wanted to take a short break to remind listeners that the Modern Mexico podcast is sponsored by Nomade Tostadores. Overall, Mexico is known for producing some of the best coffee in Latin America. Total, in 2022, Mexico exported over $600 million of raw coffee beans. One of the best local roasters in Mexico City is Nomade Tostadores. Residents and visitors can sample their high-end coffee at Cafe Blom in Colonia Juarez or Bada Funky in Colonia del Valle. Nomade coffee can also be purchased online and shipped worldwide. Check them out on Instagram. I think there in discussions about Mexico, there's sometimes this bifurcation or differentiation between the success of Mexico's legal economy and what's happening in different export sectors, and then the kind of scary chaos of what's happening up in the mountains when it comes to organized crime. But it sounds like in your research in Michoacan, you've seen that there's kind of some blurred lines between organized crime and legal business activity in Mexico. And that kind of reminds me of something else that I saw in Michoacan. And I remember that I visited a avocado packing plant that was rumored to be, or it wasn't rumored to be, it was owned by a powerful local family that was rumored to be involved in organized crime. And local people that I talked to were both very negative in their comments about the family and also a little bit scared. But they told me that the owner of the packing facility had gone into hiding and had kind of disappeared from the town. No one had seen him, but another brother in the family had been killed by a hitman, um, that basically people in the town were tired of him exploiting them or extorting them and had hired a hitman to come in and kill him. Um, but at the same time, there was another member of the family who continued to serve as a respected member of the local avocado growers association. So it was this kind of weird dynamic where there are a lot of very serious accusations about the family, but the business continues to operate and nothing had really changed. And I remember one of the kind of weird things that I saw is when I showed up in the morning to visit the facility, I saw one of the managers show up at work, well dressed with his hair gelled, carrying an assault rifle, like as casually as someone might carry, an umbrella, like just in the chance of unforeseen circumstances, he would have an assault rifle with him, and he, walked into his office and tucked it behind his desk. And I did a tour of the facility, and another one of the managers was showing me all of the crates of avocados, and she could tell exactly which farm each batch of crates had come from, and there were inspectors from the U.S. Department of Agriculture who were there, who were monitoring the avocados, and if there was any instance of some type of blight or dangerous insect being in a crate of avocados, they could immediately identify which farm it came from, and block that from being exported in order to protect the farm industry in the U.S. Um, so it seemed like there was some degree of control and regulation of the sector, and the avocado packing facility was incredibly well managed. Um, but it was a little bit strange to walk around with this manager and see crates of avocados being loaded up onto trucks. And she was telling me that within 30 hours, these avocados would be in US supermarkets. And she specifically referenced that they were sending avocados to Costco and Sam's Club. And it seemed to me to be a little bit strange that these major supermarket chains in the U.S., like Stop and Shop or Whole Foods, who are buying lots of avocados in Mexico, don't have any obligation to ethically source the avocados that they're buying, and it made me wonder whether human rights due diligence could play a role in improving the dynamic in Michoacan. And I don't know if that's something that you've thought about companies being required to ethically source avocados in Mexico as being a potential solution, or if there is any other particular policy solution that you'd like to see that you think would improve the security dynamic in Michoacan.
Yeah, very much. So I think one of the problems we've been facing in Mexico is that the whole situation just sort of lingers and gets gradually worse. And people, policymakers, and other stakeholders are just kind of grown frustrated, and many have essentially given up because they don't see levers anymore, and they don't see the actors that could bring about change, where you have a will from politicians to change the paradigm and to do the right thing. Right, so you have to get creative and thinking about new levers that could bring about that change and force people on the ground to do the right thing, even though they wouldn't be inclined to do so by, say, their ideological inclination or their preference for, well, a cleaner human rights record, for instance. So consumer power very much becomes part of our thoughts here at Crisis Group as well, about how to change that dynamic. And one of the problems is that so far the US has been treating security and trade separately. I think those two things would have to be fused in order to make a dent in the situation on the ground. And in terms of how, for instance, the avocado sector could be gradually grow less violent, and how consumption could become more ethical, I think that one way of thinking about this would be to go down the route of certification in the private sector in order to incentivize importers from the US, consumers, but also producers on the ground to try and take the right measures and pressure local government, above all, to provide better protection. And I think if you had a certification, that would be sort of analog to what happened to the Blood Diamond certification, where you wanted to get the financing of conflict out of the diamond trade, which happened with some success, not entire success, but some success at least. This would essentially not only allow consumers to be on the safe side, but also produce higher margins in the market. So you could create a structure that would pay higher for better and cleaner avocado, and then incentivize everyone to follow suit, because ultimately what the lack of change is about in Mexico is many times that elite economic interest hasn't been as affected. And here you could introduce sort of even a soft measure in order to force state actors and others to do the right thing on the ground. Because one thing that even criminal actors are really afraid of is that they turn overly powerful economic interests from the private sector against them. This is something I've been told a number of times very, very clearly by criminal leaders, including from Michoacan, that they, for instance, have taken to refraining from kidnapping overly powerful people, because those have access to the state and can make state institutions in Mexico do the right thing and send the power of the state the way of criminal groups. And you have to think about how consumer power can translate into moving elite interest in Mexico and then pressure state institutions into doing the right thing. Now, I think this is a conversation that needs to be had. But what I do not want to say, and there have been calls from Europe, for instance, to the fact that are calling for a boycott wholesale of this kind of affected produce or other products that are being exported from Mexico to North America, other parts of North America and the European Union. But if you go down the route of a wholesale boycott, you ultimately make things worse, because you pull the rug out from under a lot of hardworking families that make the living of these industries. The organized crime infiltration of these industries, and including of avocado, is not the whole picture. There is a lot of just clean, normal civilians making a living off of that, and if they were to lose their livelihoods, it would make it even easier for criminal groups to get a hold of them and suck them into, for instance, organized crime membership, including of young people from local areas that then would have even less economic alternatives to joining criminal groups.
Okay, interesting. So I guess that is an important point, is I don't think that it is helpful to advocate for a total ban on Mexican avocados, but particularly when it comes to avocados, which is a product that people see as a health product, as something that's beneficial to eat. It's part of a positive lifestyle. There should be some interest in the part of consumers in just making sure that whatever avocados they're eating have been ethically sourced and aren't financing the conflict in Michoacan, which has killed over 10,000 people in the last few years. Overall, Falko, I just want to say, super interesting to hear your perspective on all of this. And I just want to say, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me on.
I wanted to take a short break to remind listeners that Mexico is the world's #1 beer exporter. Within Mexico, however, the beer industry is dominated by two international beer giants, the companies that produce Corona and Dos Equis. Over the last decade, however, A niche market for locally produced craft beers has emerged in Mexico, and one of the best brands of cerveza artesanal in Mexico is Minerva, which is produced in Guadalajara. Visitors and locals can sample Minerva's beer at the El Deposito chain of craft beer stores in Mexico City. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you like what you heard on the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the Modern Mexico podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.